Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Retirement Plan Academy with Trust Company of Tennessee. My name is Zach Hurst. I am the moderator today, and thankfully for me, I have two expert guests joining us. My co-host, Adam Davies, who heads up our retirement plan services for the Trust Company of Tennessee and is based in our Knoxville headquarters. And Julie Graham is joining us as our featured guest today. She is with a Senior Vice President in Consulting and Employee Development with RPAG. I'm going to talk about you in just a second, Julie, because I want to hear a little bit more about that. But thank you both for joining. We have a very important topic here. Are your 401k fees competitive? Notice we say competitive, not cheap, right? There's a lot that goes into this, and we're going to explain what you as a plan sponsor, or you perhaps as somebody who's on your company's 401k committee sort of need to be aware of, and make sure that your providers are providing to you to make sure you are indeed competitive with your 401k fees. So this is not a scare tactic whatsoever. This is an information session. Yes, we can all find ways into trouble through this, but there's a pretty easy way that we're going to show you today to not find that same trouble. So we'll go through that. Before we do, we've got a few housekeeping items. Number one, somewhere on your screen, which looks different than mine, you're going to see a box that says questions. Please, if you do have questions as we go ahead and input those. We'll either get to those once we receive those, or we'll certainly save time at the end to address those. Those of you who are seeking CE credit, be it SHRM, HRCI, or CPE, please, just a couple housekeeping items here. Remember to answer, there are three live poll questions that we'll introduce as we go. Please make sure you answer those. You need to stay for at least 50 minutes. We promise we won't keep you much past that. And when you do, when we do end the session, there's a survey that you have to answer in order to receive that credit, which we will then email out to you. So hopefully I have covered that. And Julie, I want to move on to you. Instead of reading off a bio to this group, which is not the most entertaining thing in the world, perhaps briefly you could tell us a little bit more about RPAG and your role there.
Sure. Happy to be with you all today and excited to share. So I have been part of Retirement Plan Advisory Group, which is what RPAG stands for, since its inception. It was founded in 2004. So it's a national practice management platform. We provide resources and tools to advisors across the country on investment reporting, due diligence. I oversee our fee benchmarking department, so I kind of help lead our efforts across the country, working with advisors, working with employers on kind of making sure fees are competitive. I've actually been in the retirement industry my whole career. I started in 1990. That makes me feel really old right now saying that, but it's been a long time. So it's never boring and always fun and interesting. And I love working with advisors and employers, just helping them navigate this terrain a little bit and learn more about their fees and services.
Yeah, and you mentioned fee benchmarking, which I think you said you head up that product and division, right? So we're going to spend some time on that today and show plan sponsors today that there's a very easy solution that can be provided to them probably through their existing advisor already, of some kind of a fee benchmarking tool that they should be seeing on a regular basis. So for the plan sponsors out there, this is not assigning you yet another task for this one of gazillion jobs that you have with your company. Instead, it's just showing you some resources that should already be available to you. So with that, why consider fees? Seems like a bit of a silly question, but we're going to talk through some of the reasons that we have to. And clearly all of us as participants within the plan care about the fees. We care about the people, be it providers or as plan sponsors. But ERISA certainly cracks down on this. And Julie, if you want to talk us through this slide and what we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean, there's really, I'd say the four areas listed here are the main ones you see for fiduciaries to pay attention to. It's circular because it's ongoing. I think sometimes we think, oh, we just set this plan up, we don't have to think about it again. But it is an ongoing duty that you're expected to monitor your plan fees, making sure that they're competitive. You have that ongoing duty to monitor your investments so that you have a prudent process for that and documentation. Again, ensuring plan fees are reasonable, so that's something that's part of the process, and that you are also documenting that. And then, of course, disclosing those fees to plan participants, which you get some help there from the providers you work with, but I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about that piece of it. So that is, and then it's ongoing. So you don't just do it once, you continue to do that. So as your plan grows, you're ensuring that your investments and your fees are competitive with the marketplace and fair and reasonable for your plan participants.
And for those plan sponsors on the call, probably many of you have an advisor, somebody who's playing that advisory role. Some of you don't, but probably many of you do. And so, you can't escape the fiduciary role that you have as a plan sponsor. But when you're talking about monitoring to ensure you're remaining competitive and selecting investments through a prudent process, those should be documented processes provided to you by your advisor, right? So this isn't, again, we're not creating additional work for you, but instead just making sure that those that you're already paying to do this role are in fact doing that for you on a, Julie, I assume at least an annual basis, but some kind of a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, for investments, usually more frequent, but for fees, definitely at least annually.
Okay. Good. And as a participant within a plan, like probably everybody else on this call, the impact of fee reduction, Adam put this chart together. I think it's a pretty telling story, Adam, about the impact it can have on us as individuals, as participants, if we do in fact reduce fees from higher marks.
Definitely. And, a lot of the plan sponsors I work with, clients I work with, they care about minimizing fees, making sure they're competitive because they're ultimately stewards of other people's money. They care about their people and they want to do the right thing. But this chart right here can show how that can actually equate to more years of spending. So if you reduce fees by, 25 basis points, 0.25%, 0.5% or 1%, those might not sound like big numbers, but when you compound that over 20, 30, 40 years of an employee working and participating in the plan, you can see that in some cases that can lead to 5, 10, 13 years of additional spending. So that can really mean a lot to participants over long periods of time.
Yeah, it definitely can. And I like this chart just showing the actual monetary meaning to this. And, I think the biggest thing is just trying to dig in, which we're going to talk about shortly, we're trying to dig into really understand the plan fees. And again, working with your providers, hopefully there's an advisor in place who can try to figure out ways to reduce those. Because Adam, we find a lot of times coming in the advisory role that we're able to go in and sort of negotiate the other roles to bring those down a little bit. I think there's probably a lot of room for that across the industry. Would you agree?
Definitely. One of the most common things we'll see, and Julie kind of alluded to this, is that a plan might be priced appropriately when it starts or when it transfers, but then time goes on, 3, 5 years pass, and then the plan's grown, the industry has changed, and so that plan, that was once competitive might no longer be competitive. So benchmarking the plan fees, looking at the growth of the plan are all definitely important to making sure that on an ongoing basis, your fees remain competitive.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody on the call would turn down an additional $106,000 or $227,000. So good graphic. And, again, part of this is the scary part for us as providers and you as plan sponsors or those involved with the company, right? Yes, there are ways that we can face some trouble, and especially times like this year when markets are down and people are paying even more attention to it. Even if we're doing the right things, we can find ourselves caught up in some kind of allegations or even lawsuits. And we see a chart here, Julie. I think these are just a few of the cases since April of this year. So we're talking about just over about a month-long period. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. The excessive fee cases have certainly increased and grown. A lot of these are household names that you've seen before. So I would say a lot of the target's still large plans, so familiar these large companies. But we have seen it move down market, and I think also what the fee cases tell us is the importance of being proactive with those reviews. That's really what's come out of a lot of these cases is the employers that have gone through, the full litigation. They've been asked to do more, have an independent review. They were just missing that piece primarily. So I think there's lessons to learn, but not to be, it's not scary. I think we have all the tools and resources our advisors do. It's just being proactive with it. And what lessons can we learn from these cases?
Yeah, and there are many cases, Adam, I believe, cases have picked up tremendously over the last 10 years for many reasons, but there are a lot of times where there's an allegation or a case brought against an employer in which they can show clear documentation and a process, and it's not a negative impact against them. So I think as long as you can document that, Adam, and bring that, or Julie, then you got a pretty good case. Is that right?
Yep.
Definitely. And so later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about how we help our clients protect against situations like this and steps you can take as well to, prevent any sort of lawsuits against your plan.
Julie, you said cases are starting to move down market. What do you mean by that?
Well, we've seen it, instead of just in this like Xerox level, Salesforce billion-dollar plans, we've seen it move down. I wouldn't say down into the under 100 million, but still in that over 100 million space. So, it's not moved below that too much, but often in our industry, things start with these big plans and then it moves down market. That's really been the history of the 401k business. You've seen it over the years. So I don't think it'll move too far down though, because plaintiffs attorneys are looking for assets, right, to make it worth their time. So there's a lot of good lessons I think that we can learn from the cases.
Yeah. Good. And we're getting into types of fees, and this is the part where, if you're new to being a plan sponsor or you're on the committee, maybe you're new to the committee, this is the part that's it takes a little bit of time to understand. And hopefully the breakdown that we have coming up can really sort of educate you on what to look for as you hopefully take this back and maybe talk to your advisor, your providers about doing some kind of a fee study for you. But Adam, start us out with the different types of fees, looking at administrative and mutual fund fees.
Definitely. So I kind of think of these as two broad categories. The first one being administrative fees. So these are the fees essentially for running the plan, paid to service providers. So we'll talk about who those service providers are, but generally it's for things like picking the mutual funds, tracking contributions in and out, doing any sort of government testing that's required. Many of you might be familiar with the 5500. And so all of those services associated with the plan broadly fall into that administrative fees category. Separate from that are mutual fund fees. So this is what might be paid to mutual funds like Vanguard, JP Morgan, Fidelity. And so we'll see that sometimes these two, administrative and mutual fund fees, can be combined. Sometimes they're separate. But as we're looking at making sure an entire plan's fees are competitive, we want to look at both of these categories separately or together.
And Julie, thinking about what Adam just said, and thinking about places where we could conduct a study and maybe find that our fees might be a bit excessive, does it typically fall into one of these two categories where we might find excessive fees, or does it just depend?
I would say it does usually fall into one of these two categories. A lot of times where we're negotiating fees is on the administrative fee side quite a bit. So, you're trying to make sure that what they're charging for all the record keeping administration fees. So that's an area of negotiation that we work with quite a bit. Mutual fund fees also, though, you can look at when you lower your administrative fees, sometimes you can also lower your mutual fund fees. Sometimes they go hand in hand depending on the fee structure. So it's really about looking at the total and seeing where, what makes sense. If you're competitive on your administrative fee side, maybe there's something more on the investment side where we can still reduce.
Okay. All right, and with that, let's launch poll question number 1. Joanna behind the scenes is going to help us with that. And we've had some people arrive a little bit tardy. So again, anyone seeking CE credit of any kind, please make sure you do answer this, as it's a requirement of HRCI, SHRM, as well as CPE, and they're just kind of fun to answer anyway. So do you have multiple service providers or one service provider? And you see the answers here. Yes, multiple, maybe somebody just has one, or I'm not sure. Julie, give me your best guess at which is the winner here.
The first one.
About multiple providers?
Yeah, I don't know. It's probably pretty close between the second one and the first one.
As it, while we're giving people a chance to answer this, is it trending one way or another industry-wide?
Well, I would say I typically see one provider more upmarket. So when you get into larger plans, you tend to see one provider, at least for record keeping and administration. I think overall the market's multiple because you've got advisors always independent of your provider. So that piece of it would be the separate piece.
There you go.
Yeah.
And you see the answers there. So yeah, using one provider looks like it's got the majority here, and I'm not sure is a perfectly fine answer. That might be somebody who is not involved with the plan directly, or somebody who just isn't sure because it's hard to understand these things sometimes. So either way, hopefully this will educate all of you on some of the different options that you have as committee members or sponsors. So with that, let's move into, again, we talked about two things, administrative fees versus mutual fund fees. Adam, it looks like we're focusing on administrative fees. And again, looking at what we just talked about, be it multiple providers versus one provider.
Definitely, and this might provide a little bit more clarity for anyone who answered "I'm not sure" to the previous poll question. So generally what we see is one of two service models. The first one being that you might use multiple service providers. So if you look towards the left-hand side of the screen, you might have up to 3 different providers doing the different functions of the plan. So you might work with an advisor who will pick the investments, the mutual funds, monitor them, look at them on an ongoing basis. The record keeper, that's the person that's tracking contributions in and out, distributions, loans, if your plan have them. And then finally, administration, preparing the 5500, doing the required discrimination testing. Each of those different services can sometimes be provided by a different service provider. As Julie mentioned, sometimes you'll see the record keeping and administration combined. Maybe you have that set up and no advisor, or even sometimes you might have all 3, advisor, record keeper, and administration being provided by one provider. And so that's something we do for a lot of our clients here at the Trust Company. So then the alternative to that would be that bundled service provider, and that's where you work with one provider really doing all of the different functions of a retirement plan. I wouldn't say there's one right or wrong service model. It's really what you're preferring for your plan. A lot of times having everything under one roof can be a little bit more convenient for clients.
So I'm going to move to the left side of the screen here, the multiple service providers. Adam, I want to be sure you're in agreement with this. If somebody has an advisor already in place that they enjoy working with and they do a great job for them, but perhaps they're having some troubles with the record keeper and administrator, can that plan sponsor turn to the advisor and say, go shop this for us to find a new record keeper and administrator for this plan?
Definitely. I'd say most often we see the advisor serving as the quarterback of the relationship.
Yeah.
So beyond just picking the investments, monitoring the funds, they may also help with benchmarking the plan fees. Zach, like you mentioned, shopping other record keepers, helping set up those due diligence meetings. But sometimes we don't see that, and the advisor might play just a pure advisory role. That is pretty common if you're working with, say, a traditional stock picker or advisor, typically a wirehouse that maybe does wealth management as well and just kind of dabbles in the 401k space. But if you are working with someone who is an expert in 401k plans, the retirement plan industry, most often they'll serve as the quarterback for the entire relationship.
Okay. And then vice versa. So if there's not an advisor in place, or perhaps that advisor is not providing the service that the plan sponsor wants, do plan sponsors typically turn to that record keeper to go help them seek that advisor, or is it more about just shopping locally to find a good provider?
Yeah, I would say a lot of times record keepers are reluctant to get into any sort of helping find an advisor. More often than not, they don't want to take on any fiduciary status with recommending or not recommending different options. And so at that point, if you're not working with an advisor, it would probably be incumbent on the plan sponsor to do that due diligence themselves, or then go find that advisor to do that on their behalf.
So Julie, Adam's being Switzerland here, and he won't commit to one of these. Are you going to do the same thing, or do you like one better than the other?
I am going to also be Switzerland. I don't like one of, I feel like what we always want to do is educate employers on these choices, but we don't have a preference one way or the other. It's really what works best for the plan, because every employer is a little bit unique on what their needs are.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So we've covered administrative fees, and we're going to get into a little bit more about how to locate these fees and some of the forms that you can look for these. Maybe these are oftentimes a lot easier to find because you actually have provided documents than, Adam, perhaps mutual fund fees are. Is that fair?
Definitely. And so here we're going to cover, the second part of fees, and that's what's paid to the mutual fund managers. So you might recognize names like Vanguard or JP Morgan, BlackRock, Prudential. There's many, many different investment management firms out there. And so this is an important component of making sure overall plan fees are competitive, because we'll see in just a little bit, there's different share classes, there's active and passive. We see fees on the low end range from 0.02% all the way up to 1.2%. So the investments that you pick can definitely have a big impact on the overall plan cost.
And this is where, in my experience, plan sponsors could be a bit vulnerable to not understanding the entire picture of this, and that's just because of what providers sometimes will educate on, right? So they'll capture the fees of the advisor if there is one, the record keeper, and the administrator, perhaps that's bundled, and they'll come and say you're paying a total of 45 basis points, 0.545% for the plan. And the behind the scenes, which isn't readily available or evident on some of the documents you receive, you're paying an underlying mutual fund cost of 1.2%, which is very excessive, right? And then all of a sudden, the plan fees that felt low are very excessive. So this is a missing piece I see a lot of times talking to plan sponsors, and it's good to just go be able to help educate them and say, just look at as you both mentioned already, look at the entire picture, because these matter just as much as those advisory fees matter, as Adam just illustrated a couple slides ago.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so how are fees actually paid? Julie, we've got individually listed and revenue sharing. Try to make this make sense for us.
Yeah, it's I feel like fees in our industry we haven't made it easy for employers to understand it. It's like we try to simplify, but it has always been a little complicated. So individually listed is where those fees are stated explicitly, would be maybe another way to say that, where you've got your hard dollar, or maybe it's a percentage of assets, but it's paid directly to the providers. It's transparent. You might even see it on your statement. And so it's very clear. And then you've got the lowest cost mutual funds in the plan in that structure, where your fees for the funds are truly separate from all the other fees for the plan. So they're not kind of packaged, they're listed separate. Revenue sharing is how a lot of plans have paid the fees for years. I would say that trend has been changing, more moving to I would call it more individually listed structure and away from revenue sharing. But I still see a lot of plans with revenue sharing, and that's where I would say all your fees are sort of married together in your mutual fund expense. So you don't see the breakout. And so it's harder to understand who's getting paid what, because it's all kind of baked into one number. And that number of your fund fees, you may not always know what it is, because when you see your statements or you get your rate of return on your plan for your own account, you just get the net rate of return. You don't necessarily see what's already been deducted. So that's where revenue sharing is a little bit more challenging. But it's okay to have it in your plan. It just is better to understand how much it is by fund, and you'll see that a little later when Adam goes through an example of that.
So the revenue sharing, is that, I guess I'll call our own industry out here, we've done so much better about being transparent about fees over the last 10 to 20 years, but is that a product of just how it's easier for these firms to work together and get paid? Or is it trying to make it confusing and hide fees? I mean,
well, I think historically it was employers didn't want to pay for the plan out of their own pockets. So when it started, it was just a way to pay for the plan and make it real easy for an employer to set it up and then pay for the plan, really through the plan fees, or technically the participants are paying for their plan. And then maybe they're focusing more of their budget line item for the match cost, and they want to spend that more for the plan and have the plan pay these fees. So I think it was just the original setup being thinking that was going to be simplified, but I think as plans have grown, it has made it a little more complex now. Looking back, maybe that would have not been the way we would have set it up if we had hindsight 2020.
Yeah, I got
yeah.
So I'm still thinking about, for the plan sponsor, if they have a takeaway and action item from the call, where to turn to first. So in either one of these, the individually listed or the revenue sharing, if the plan sponsor has an advisor in place, should that advisor be able to pull any and all fees they're paying on either one of these categories?
Yes, and you should get regular reporting on that, even from your provider. Your advisor should be going through that at least once a year, if not more frequently, so you can understand, especially if you are using revenue sharing, you really want to understand the breakdown on all your investments and how much they're revenue sharing.
Okay. And
Yeah.
so just to be clear, so if, John Smith, who has his own investment shop as the advisor, he should be the one that's able
Yeah.
to report the fidelity fees, the record keeper fees to the plan sponsor.
Well, they should be able to
Okay.
walk them through it for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Good. All right. Very informative, and you kept it simple. I challenge you to do the same thing with this. These are
I
these
know.
share classes we talked about.
Yeah.
This does get pretty choppy, right? This is pretty granular, and this is a lot
Yeah.
of industry jargon. But Julie, tell me
Yeah.
if I'm wrong. This might be the most important thing to know, so you can understand where you might be overcharged that you just don't know about right
Right. Yeah, it is. And I love the slide because I love visuals. And I think this one, even though it is a little bit of industry jargon, it does give you the visual of any investment you have in your plan. And this is an example of the principal lifetime target date fund, but it could be any fund. This particular fund has 7 different prices. So you have 7, it's the same fund, but it's got 7 different ticker symbols and different fees. So you see the total fees at the end. The reason you have 7 different ways of pricing is a plan, let's say of $1 million might have a different fee for service than let's say a plan of 10 million. So you have different prices, or we call them different share classes of the same fund. The reason it's really the most important slide, and I say a big takeaway here, is this is really the main issue of the fee cases, is this particular problem of employers being able to move to a lower price share class. So from, let's say, an R2 to R3, or even R3 to say A share in this example, where let's take R3 to A, you're going from 1.21% of fees to 1.02 and saving that money. And so the fee cases revolve around employers not being proactive enough with this and their ability to have gotten a lower share class sooner, and they ignored it and didn't do it. And so that's what almost all the fee cases revolve around. So the more proactive you're keeping an eye on, really what share class are we paying today? And are we getting the lowest price we could be getting because our plans now doubled in size? Should we still have the same fee? So I would say, just that's something any advisor should absolutely be doing to make sure as your plan keeps growing, you're continually getting the lowest price. And if you're in more of the model where you're going to have the explicit or individually priced plan where it's all, separated out, that gets you to the institutional price at the top. So when you're paying more of those fees separate from the investments, you'll have the lowest net expense ratio on the investment side. That's the top one. And you can do that kind of structure with any size plan. It's just a matter of looking at these share classes to make sure mainly that you're always getting the best price as your plan keeps growing.
Okay, so R5, R4A, R3, R2, and R1, all of those are revenue sharing models. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so this institutional at the top, what a plan sponsor, as they think about this, right? You see the 12B1 fee and the other expenses, that means below, that means that those are being paid out to other parties. So a plan sponsor, if I understand this, Julie, needs to go understand what they're paying advisor, record keeper, administrator,
right,
and combine that, whatever's not included here, to that institutional, and see how that fits against these other categories. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Okay, got it. And I had a good question come in actually as you were talking. Let me pull this up.
Okay.
I like this one. It says earlier you had mentioned that fees are smaller for larger plans, right? So somebody mentioned that along the way. It says, will my plan be moved into lower expense share classes as it grows? So I guess what they're asking is, does it automatically happen, or how does this work?
Yeah, it does not automatically happen. And that's why you have to be regularly meeting and monitoring and having conversations, having your advisor look at this proactively and work with your record keeper. Often, I'm sure Adam and Zach do this, where you're negotiating, and sometimes we have to negotiate with the providers to move you into that lower share class before. Sometimes they may not be ready, and we've got to negotiate, or they've got to negotiate on your behalf. So it does not happen automatically, which is why there's so many excessive fee cases. That the plaintiff's attorneys have really jumped on that bandwagon, if you will. So you want to pay attention to it and make sure that your advisor is regularly just checking in and making sure that you are getting moved to these lower share classes.
Yeah, and I think, Adam, through my experience with this, we're in cases where we serve as advisor and it's on another platform. Clearly that's our role and that's the business we're in, and we understand to go do that. But you mentioned earlier, Adam, there's some advisors, to no fault of their own, that this is just sort of a secondary business, right? Their primary business is more individual wealth management, and they also have some plans through those great relationships they've built. And I hope I haven't told this story before, but there's a person that we're close with, and that we're not. That's not a client of ours, but close contact, and their plan has grown by $30 million over the course of about 6 years. I mean, it's just been tremendous what they've done there. And to his credit, this person knows this stuff very well and is all over it. And so we started talking about the fees, and I said, "Has that moved down yet?" And he said, "I don't think so." And he said, "I said, well, it probably should, and probably should considerably." He said, "Well, I guess I need to call them." I was like, "No, tell your advisor to call them." He said something like, "They do that?" I said, "Yes." I said, "You're paying the advisor. Go tell the advisor to go do the work for you. This should not be your job." So I just want to tell plan sponsors on the call that you are paying for a service, and make sure you're putting those people to work and using that service. And I think, Adam, I may have cut you off if you were going to say something on this.
Oh, yeah. So earlier you mentioned I was Switzerland on a previous topic, and this is one where I will not be Switzerland. And so personally, I'm not a fan of the revenue sharing model. The trust company is not a fan of that model for all of the reasons you listed, Julie and Zach, is that you do have to proactively negotiate, move, change as the plan size increases. And so if you go from a $1 to a $10 million plan, you have to take that action to move from an R2 share class to an R3 and then an R4, and that disrupts participants' activity. There's a blackout notice that has to go with that. It's a true fund change. You have a different ticker in the plan. And so that's why for all of our clients, we start with the institutional share class. There's no hidden revenue, no additional fees. And so we'll explicitly state any of our services, on the statements, on the reports that go to the plan sponsor. So it is very easy to understand what the fees are and how they're paid.
Good points. And Julie, thanks for simplifying that. I know that's difficult to do, but I think it makes a lot more sense now. So thank you. And with that, Joanna, again, who is not visible but is with us, if you will pop up poll question number 2. And again, a reminder to all those seeking any type of CE credit, please do answer this to be sure that we can include that in the email we send back on this. So, does your plan incorporate fees in the fund net expense ratio, or assess them separately? And again, you've got one of those 2 answers, or I'm not sure. Adam, I'll put you on the spot this time if you have a guess at the winner.
Well, I'm sure we have several clients on the webinar today, and so the answer will be number 2 for any of you. But I'll be curious. I'll be curious to see how the breakdown will shake out.
Were you just afraid your clients were going to say, "I'm not sure"?
No, we cover fees pretty often, so I'm sure they all know.
Yeah, and we'll give just a minute for an answer here and let that pop up. And then we've had a couple other questions come in, so thank you for submitting those. A couple of them both of those we're going to cover in upcoming slides. But when those get here, Julie, I think you're covering both slides. I will bring those to your attention so we can at least make sure we cover it directly.
Great.
So just one more minute. Let the results come in, as I believe they are right now. And we got a pretty close split. A lot of I'm not sure's here, which, hopefully this is a call that's going to help clear a lot of this up. Is that hopefully accurate, Adam and Julie?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. And, I think just the sheer magnitude of how many people answered I'm not sure just shows how confusing this topic is. And as Julie mentioned, our industry has not done a good job of making it easy for plan sponsors to understand.
Yeah, which is so amazing to me, and I don't know if you all have seen, I'm going off topic here a little bit, maybe on a rant, but I don't know if you've seen or heard much on this, but it seems like this area, the governing body is so parental in nature, right? And so protective and careful about investments and everything on that side. And Julie, it just doesn't feel like that's the case on the fee side. Am I wrong there?
I think it's lack of understanding. No, you're not wrong. I feel like it's, when we've helped the clients, let's say going through an audit, if they've gotten like a DOL audit on their plan, it's just shocking what the auditors, the DOL auditors don't even understand how these fees work. Like we have to educate them. So yeah, I think they just don't get it.
Yeah. So, and I'm not sure there is perfectly acceptable. And we also don't anticipate you're going to watch this call and 5 years later be able to say everything that we just said back to you. But hopefully it is a good starting point with your advisor to keep these conversations going and to make sure they're bringing to you this in a very clear picture, as Julie just did for us. So Adam, we're going to talk just for a minute about investments because this does relate to fees. You're going to have some ways to get very, very low costs and some ways where you might have to pay a little bit more for higher performance. So what does that mean?
Definitely. So, I mentioned the range of mutual fund net expense ratios can be from 0.02% all the way up to 1.2% plus. And so part of what will determine that is if you're using a low-cost index fund or an actively managed fund. And so what are the difference between the two? So an index fund is just trying to replicate the performance of an index. Many of us might know the S&P 500. So rather than try to beat the S&P 500, you just own the 500 largest stocks in the US and do so for a very low fee. Other funds are trying to beat their respective index, and so that requires a person, a team, looking at stocks and making those decisions. And so with that comes a slightly higher fee. So for us at the trust company, what we're trying to do is minimize those fees and look at the highest return after fees. So we don't want to lose sight of the return part of the equation. There's the fees, there's the returns, and what's going to be the best bang for your buck after all fees are considered. And so what we've found is that certain areas like large cap US and even different types of government fixed income, there's really not a lot of opportunity for managers to do that work, uncover that additional return potential in excess of their fee. And so for those spaces, we recommend going low cost, replicating the index at a very, very low fee. But then other areas like small cap, international, different types of fixed income, there is that opportunity to earn a greater return beyond that higher management fee. And so those cases, we're okay paying a slightly higher fee because we anticipate the return will be even greater than that. So as you're looking at the mutual fund side, you definitely want to consider not just what's the share class, but also what is the net expense ratio combined with the return potential. And so that's something we do for our clients and really try to find that best bang for your buck in terms of return versus fees for the investment strategy.
So I misspoke a second ago. There was a question that came in actually on this slide, Adam. This came in very, very early on from somebody who looks like they've dealt with this before and understands what an index fund is. It's, can I avoid lawsuits or trouble by using all index funds to keep my costs low? I think you've just addressed that, but if you just want to answer that directly.
Yeah, so the first slide that Julie talked about basically said that as a plan sponsor, you need to monitor plan fees to make sure they're reasonable. The Department of Labor and other government agencies were very careful not to say that make sure your plan fees are the lowest, the cheapest. And so what you're looking for here is reasonable. And so I could actually make the case that by picking an all index fund lineup, you're actually doing a disservice to your participants because you're ignoring the return side of the equation. You're only looking at what's the cheapest fund and not looking at what's the best returning fund after all fees are considered. And so we think it's important to look at both sides of the equation. What's the return potential? What are the fees? And what's the best marriage between the two?
And last question for me on this, and let me go back. If I can figure my machine out here. Let me go back to this for a second here, Adam. You mentioned that we and probably a lot of others are going out and finding places where we can find those index funds at a very low cost. What is a very low cost for an index fund?
So I'd say below 0.10%. And so for a very popular strategy like the S&P 500, it could be 0.02 to 0.04. Target date funds, the cheapest is 0.09%, in a mutual fund equivalent. And so it'll change a little bit on the strategy, but I would say kind of below 0.2%.
Okay, got it. I'll flip back to this. Clearly, that doesn't need to be your net expense ratio on the investment side, which I'm a little bit apples to oranges here anyway. But you start to blend some of those management fees. And Julie and Adam, I think that is probably, at least in today's environment, this is ever changing, but in today's environment where active managers are having so much trouble in that large cap space, which is usually the heaviest allocation, it's probably reasonable to find underlying investment fees of 0.2, 0.3, 0.4%. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think so.
So just some things to think about, and let's get into fee disclosures. It is now Adam's turn to try to simplify the complicated, and we're going to look at how do you go find the fees of those providers that you have, and really all fees you need to find. So we're looking at two different forms here, Adam, which I don't expect anybody to remember these names, but perhaps they can easily identify them on their platforms by looking at these.
Sure. So Zach, you mentioned a comment earlier about the government really trying to be parental and try to encourage more adoption of fees and making sure they're competitive. And so they did take some steps towards that in 2012. They put out the 408B2 disclosure requirements, and basically that was addressed at the revenue sharing model. And it was so complicated for plan sponsors to really dive under the hood and figure out what are the 12B1 fees, what are sub-TA fees. I'm speaking in industry jargon here, but there's a lot of different fees that could be under the hood of a mutual fund. And so they wanted to simplify that by putting out the 408B2. And so to your point, Zach, you should be able to go to your record keeper and say, provide me a copy of my 408B2. Some will even list it on your plan sponsor access on the website. And so you can pull down those funds, and it should explicitly state these are all of the revenue sharing additions underneath the hood of these funds. And then on a separate level, the participant fee disclosure, this is the 404A5. It's required to go out annually. And so you'll see a listing of all of the investment options in the plan. It'll show the net expense ratio for the funds. Often, if you're unsure if there's any revenue sharing, you can take a look at those expense ratios in those share classes. If you see an R3, an R2, and R1, and an expense ratio above, 0.7, that's probably a good indication that there's probably some revenue share underneath the hood of that fund.
Okay. Good. And those 404A5, the participant disclosures, that's something that the plan sponsors and the committee should be receiving from either their advisor or record keeper to distribute out to their employees, correct, or their participants?
Correct. And this is always something you're able to request from them if you would like an updated copy, or maybe just, got that email, passed it on, never really looked at it. So this could be a good opportunity to take a fresh look at it.
Good. So we have saved the best for last. And we're going to get into just a couple slides before we wrap up about fee benchmarking and some ways that you, the plan sponsor, can very, very easily on a regular basis determine if you are indeed competitive with your fees. So before we do that, poll question number 3 is going to pop up in just a second. And final reminder for CE credit, please do answer these. And this is, when was the last time you benchmarked plan fees? Within the past 1 year, within the past 3 years, within the past 5 years, or 5+ years, the last time you benchmarked plan fees. And just to be clear, if I'm reading this correctly, Julie, this is not asking the last time they went out to bid, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So not talking about RFPs here, but the last time you sat down with somebody and looked at this and said, how do we stack up against industry norms, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Julie, without saying, if the answer is yes, without saying it, is there a right answer here?
I think there's not like the Department of Labor doesn't give a time frame specifically, but most of the ERISA community, so if you talk to ERISA attorneys, they say you need to go more out, to more an in-depth review, let's say more detailed type of review, whether that's an RFI or an RFP, maybe 3 to 5 years, but you should be reviewing your fees annually, at least going through some kind of a benchmark, even at least once a year.
Yeah, it looks like most are on this call, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
So that's something Adam mentioned. We've got some clients on the call, and that's something we're providing at least annually, just depending on what their preference is. And as you just referenced, some aren't doing it every year, and okay, that's okay, right? You're still working that in every maybe 3 years or so, and it sounds like that's okay to do. But with the right tools from your advisor, it's a really easy process. So, if you do have that advisor in place, I would just have them bring it to you at least annually. Is that okay to say, Julie?
I think so, yeah, especially today. I think we have great tools now that maybe 10 years ago, maybe we didn't have as much of this great technology that exists today, which makes it easy to deliver and walk a client through and deliver that type of benchmarking report. The 408B2 and 404A5 are complicated even sometimes for us to decipher, I have to say. You know, they're not, record keeper to record keeper does it differently. So being able to have an expert like Adam and Zach that can walk you guys through and understand that. And that helps populate things like this, fee benchmarking. So using a fee benchmarking tool that shows how you compare to peers is what I would recommend annually. And so you've got, in this example, a plan of 5 million with 50 plan participants. And you can see the universe of plans it's being compared to is over 2,200 plans in this particular market segment. And then you can see on investments, record keeping fees, and advisory fees. So breaking out those three and getting the total cost. You know, look at how this plan compares to the low average of the group, the average, and then the high or more expensive. This particular plan is actually on the higher side. If you look at the investment fee, the record keeping fee, the advisor fee is competitive, but the other two are making it fall a little bit more close to, I would say, closer to the high average. So these are conversations the advisor should be having to say, here's, you know, let's look at what your plan is looking like today versus the, you know, marketplace of data for your peers. If it's coming in a little bit on the higher end, that's where you may want to look a little bit more, little deeper, take a deeper dive into it. But this at least will show you how you stack up. And I think you want to have this in your fiduciary file, at least show you have the documentation, have it in your committee minutes that you had the conversation at least once a year.
Yeah, so it looks like on this one, I'm looking at the bottom part of the screen. So my takeaway from this, the sample is that the blue, the record keeping fee, is perhaps a bit excessive. Perhaps what's driving it higher, and so maybe this is that cue to plan sponsors to reach out to their advisor and say, "Help me with this."
Yeah.
Is that what they do? Okay.
Right. Yeah, you can definitely see, and if you look at the total, you know, this is coming in a total of 1,650, and the high is 1,770. So you're quite a bit above even the average for this particular example.
And I'm glad I just glanced at the next slide because I was about to ask you what are they supposed to do if they're high? So
right.
I think you're going to address that.
Yeah. So I think when the fees trending high, and it's hard to know. That's why we have to do these benchmarking reviews, because there's not necessarily, with plans being custom priced, to be able to dig a little deeper, you want to kind of get more of a live bid scenario. So it's still a benchmarking, but you're doing more of a process where you're taking more detail about your specific plan demographics and, you know, what your service needs are. It's not just about the fee. You want to look at the value of the services being provided. You know, what's the fee, you know, compared to, you know, everyone else for the same service levels, and really take a deep dive. So benchmarking, where we use live bid, is the best way to negotiate that record keeping fee lower, because you can look at what the marketplace is stating for the same services, looking at quality record keepers or platforms that compare to your incumbent provider, and you really can negotiate that. So it's, you know, without the live bid, it's hard to know where you want your fee to be. So the live bid gives you a range, as you can see here at the top line. With this particular plan, the competitive average comes in at 0.38 and the current fee is 0.47, the record keeping fee. So now we can go back to, in this case, John Hancock could be any provider, but in the example, and get them reduced. So you really do need to, you know, take this step if the fees are coming in high, and I think it does help to negotiate and to also document that you've gone through this extra step to get that record keeping fee reduced.
Gotcha. So for somebody who works with an advisor, which is probably most people on the call, does every advisor have a tool like that? I mean, how does this work? Does every advisor have a tool like this, or do they have the ability to get a tool like this?
Yeah, so not everybody has the tool. The RPAG or RPAG built this tool, so we built it a long time ago, and it is available, but only for advisors that really access the platform to use it. So I think this is probably the most robust tool, in my opinion, out there in the industry, because it's clear. You can actually follow the information. So I know you all have access to the tool, but there's other tools out there, but I think the level of depth that this report goes into is not one that every advisor is accessing.
And as I said that, somebody just wrote in and corrected me when I said most people on the call have an advisor. They say, I don't work with an advisor, so what are my options?
Yeah, well, there's great advisors out there, so you want to be able to look at the marketplace. Certainly, Adam and Zach can help you with that. So I would say ask around and get some information. Yeah, for that role.
Okay. Okay. So this isn't something where, typically speaking, anyway, plan sponsors on their own can't just go find a service like this, right? It's more working with advisors.
Yeah, I mean, trying to find an advisor, yeah, doing this on their own, I think, is why we built this whole system, because employers on their own trying to benchmark their fees is just too complicated. I've never run into an employer in 30 years of doing this that really understood what they were paying for their plan and could benchmark it correctly. They would benchmark maybe not necessarily apples to apples.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would recommend most employers would have a really hard time trying to do this themselves.
Okay.
And Zach, if I think back to your lawsuit page, where we talked about all the different lawsuits that happened just in the last month. I feel like this and the screen before it are really the best defense against any sort of lawsuit that might be brought. And that, if someone, alleged excessively high fees, you could point to this report in your fiduciary file and say, look, we've benchmarked the plan fees and, 2019, 2020, 2021, we stayed on top of it. Plan fees were reasonable. And then something we do at the trust company is that, we know what plans cost at different size levels, different levels of participants. And so we've built into our fee schedule those automatic fee reductions so that, if we start working with a plan at $1 million and it grows to $10 million, that fee is going to automatically adjust without the need to, proactively monitor it and say, hey, do we need to reprice the plan? But of course, we're going to be doing that benchmarking along the way, using independent third-party data like our PAG, so that you do have that protection in your fiduciary file.
Good. It is a great tool, and we are fond of this tool, and I think it's very clear and easy to read. And just one note, I'm going to look at the bottom again here. This is this fee is, whether it's reasonable or competitive or not, that's really, I guess, up for debate. Documentation is very important, right? So if you notice you got a little bit of a higher fee, you go back, you shop it around a little bit, and you just can't get a better bid. Document it, right? You're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
If you're closer to average, it's okay, right? If you're happy with all your providers and you're at the average mark, well, it's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Even this one, it came in a little bit above average, but it's closer. But you can really demonstrate the value. There is a lot of value in what your record keeper and service providers are doing, and so you want to. You can certainly document the value that you have from what all they're providing. Maybe it's additional mailings or meetings, education. There's so many different areas that that can include. So yeah, you just document it and show that it's fair and reasonable, and I think that serves you well in your fiduciary monitoring and in your file.
Great, and we'll wrap up with this, Adam. This is just a model I think that, well, I know that we use and you've created, and perhaps you're showing this to show maybe how somebody could look at everything in one sheet. Is that what you're going for here?
Definitely. So, anyone who answered, I'm not sure how the plan fees are paid, or, if you haven't benchmarked your plan fees, within the last 3 years, this might be something you're interested in. And so all the time we'll have, folks that we don't currently work with that'll say, hey, I don't know what my plan fees are. Can you help us get a better handle on that? And so in this example, it's an American Fund client. You can see all of their funds are from that one provider. And so right off the bat, looking at the R3 share class and looking at the mutual fund expense being over 1% in many cases, we know that there's revenue sharing baked into some of those funds. And so what we can do is present a nice report to you, kind of stripping out what that is, so that we can show what's your true record keeping fee, what's your true TPA fee, if there's any advisor fees, and really nail down what that total plan cost is and help you benchmark it to see if it is competitive for your size and participant count.
You both have done a magnificent job of simplifying the difficult, made it very understandable. So thank you. And Julie, thanks for the introduction to, again, a great tool that we have through your company. And I think one that could benefit a lot of plan sponsors. So with that, we have covered all questions. Maybe check that one more time. We have. And Adam has a nice little visual of what he is envisioning for the next 2 months. We are going to go enjoy the summer and take June and July off. We're going to come back in August. There is a lot happening yet again in Washington, D.C. right now with a lot of legislature, Secure Act 2.0. Perhaps we're going to get more information about that in August, which would mean potential sizable changes to the 401k and retirement plan space. So we will come back with more on that. As soon as we have more on that, you will get a recording of this webinar, and please reach out to any of us should you have any questions. Julie, you're great. Thank you so much for joining us. Adam, always good to be with you, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.